Hello and welcome to the week's class notes on Othello. This week I'm going to be talking primarily about how to write a short analysis so that you can all prepare for writing your papers this week. But I'll use some examples from Othello as well as the Canterbury Tales and Beowulf as some examples of what I'm talking about. So the first thing I'd like to begin with is just talking about the assignment sheet itself. Some of you might have already read that. But make sure, whether it's for my class or for any class, one thing you always want to do is carefully read through it. Take notes of words or phrases that indicate the purpose of the analysis, any criteria you see for how the analysis will be assessed, any special requirements you see in there for the paper, any formatting requirements, those might be specific to the professor, and any deadlines noted in there. So here I've got the example of the assignment sheet from our class. So in the case of the paper that you're writing for this week, it means looking in detail at the short paper 1 assignment sheet that's in our week's folder. I just want to say a couple words about it. You can see in here that in this introductory section, that really just sort of sets the stage in terms of the tone of how I want you approaching the work, how I want you thinking about it. The real meat of it is this assignment chunk right here. So in there, that's where I'm giving you any specific expectations I have for it, including a page range, what the purpose of it is, what you should be doing in it, the fact that you're using MLA format, which I'll talk about in a moment. And you'll see I put into bold what I think are really the key terms out of that. And then here, this gives you some more information about how you might choose a topic, which I'll also say a few more words about in a moment, as well as the criteria that I'm going to use for when I grade the paper, which are right here. The due date, and then the fact that it's worth 10% of your final grade. So when you're deciding what you want to analyze, first you want to review your notes in your notebook and the notes that you took in your textbook for passages that jump out at you. You should ask yourself, while you're doing that, what passages seemed especially memorable, interesting, compelling, weird, confusing, complicated, or personally meaningful to you. So you're really trying to just find a passage that you're excited to write about. I'm giving you free rein to choose whatever you want from the materials that we've read up through this week. So choose something that you'll be excited about. You should choose a passage to analyze that will allow you the opportunity to explore some initial ideas you had about it in a deeper, more complex manner. So one thing you want to avoid is something where it seems like you've already sort of said everything you're going to say about it, or there's not much meat to it, perhaps. You really want to choose a rich passage that will allow you to dig into it and spend some time really analyzing it in close detail. So make sure the passage you chose has a logic behind the selection. So for instance, you may choose an entire monologue from a character in Othello, or the full description of one of the characters in the prologue of the Canterbury Tales, or an important action sequence in Beowulf. Try not to cut off important text that's really part of that moment in the larger narrative. So like you wouldn't want to use some dialogue between characters, but leaving off the most important moment in their exchange. So you want to be smart about sort of what your starting point is, what your ending point is. You wouldn't want to use a speech from Beowulf that misses a crucial line of his speech. So you really want to think about choosing selectively, and again, going by the requirements for the assignment. That's an intended range that's described in there in terms of how long the passage might be. So something that's a little over is fine, a little under is fine, but you want it to be rich enough where you can talk about it in detail, but not so big that you can't really focus in on the details in your analysis. So take note that I'm inviting you all to revise one of your discussion board posts for this assignment, so that it is an option. So if you think you have a post from the semester so far, so that can be including this week, that can be thoroughly revised into a short analysis, then go for it. So once you've made that choice, you want to reread the passage that you selected multiple times, take notes again as you read. Now you're thinking about it again, you're pushing yourself to dig deeper with it. Make sure you understand line by line what's being said in the passage. So you want to make sure, as a good starting point, that you just understand what's happening in that passage, what's being said, what events are taking place. You may even want to write your own translation of the passage, kind of in your own modern-day English, if that helps you. And that's a skill that we've talked about in past weeks. So decide what you want your analysis to focus on within that passage. This is a really critical moment in your writing process, since it's at this point that you'll start to give shape to your notes. What most interests you about the passage, and does that focus allow you to talk in detail about many of the passage's features? So you're not really just choosing a passage, you're choosing what about that passage you're really going to focus on. That focus should be centered on some theme, an idea, an image, a character, a plot moment, whatever, that you find especially significant and worth delving into in great detail. So once you've chosen your focus, decide how you want to organize your notes, and thus your paper. Two typical patterns of organization are either to order your analysis following essentially the same order of the lines in the original, or to organize based on some other logical principle that makes sense given your focus. So neither pattern is inherently better. It's probably a little easier to just follow along with the order of the original, but that's not necessarily best depending on what your purpose is. It really all comes down to which organization pattern best suits your focus and overall point in your analysis. So for instance, if you choose to analyze the scene from The Miller's Tale where John falls for the trick of hiding in his makeshift raft to prepare for the coming flood, you might discuss line by line how that scene is presented, or you might organize it by some of the ironic parallels between John's story and the biblical version. And that's true for almost any passage. It depends on what you want to highlight, but just recognize that you do have a choice there, and that really falls into one of these two major patterns. As you organize your notes, based on the pattern of organization that you're going to follow, you should also be thinking about how you're going to use paragraphs in your essay to organize your ideas, and if there's a single main idea emerging from your analysis. That's one thing you want to keep thinking about is there sort of a main idea that's coming out of this that become the main point of my paper. So at this stage, you can begin drafting the paper itself. So since for this short paper assignment, you're not being asked to write a full essay, you really should, when you start drafting, really kind of just begin working with the notes that you've already taken and your outline. If you've done a good job with your pre-writing work, you've actually already done a lot of the heavy lifting of writing the paper. Focus as you write your first draft on clearly explaining your points and using evidence to back them up. So even though the paper really should focus on getting right into your analysis, make sure that prior to the analysis, you first state in the paper what passage you're analyzing, tell us both where to find it in the primary text and what it is. So you might just say, let's say you're analyzing a passage from Othello. You might say, in this paper, I will be focusing on a speech given by Iago shortly after this happens in the play because, and then you give your reason. You should also clarify the larger context of the passage, so what has happened just before and after it. That can be very brief, but it just helps the reader kind of remind themselves of what's going on in the play or the text at that moment, how it fits into the text as a whole. So if you're revising one of your discussion board prompts, which again is an option here, your temptation may be to only make minor changes as you begin writing it, but for your paper to really succeed, you'll need to make more substantial changes so that it reads as a polished and deeply explored analysis and not just, that first discussion board post, which now maybe you have a really sophisticated initial post and maybe you don't have to do a lot with it, but you should be the judge of that. You should ask yourself, how much more work do I have to do with this? How far do I want to push it? What I don't want to see is just a cut and paste discussion board post, put into a Word document, and then submitted as your paper. It should be pushed further than that. So that might mean cutting material out, adding in new material, definitely making changes to what's in there. So when it comes to actually using the primary text you're analyzing, you want to be thinking about the fact that in a literary analysis, you should always work towards balancing your interpretation of the text with evidence from the text to illustrate your points. You want to avoid the trap of just summarizing what happens in the text. Make sure you're not merely summarizing. You want to be analyzing, right? So that's constantly moving back and forth between discussing the details of the text and saying something about it. So the evidence that you're using can come in three forms. So first is references to the text, where you summarize or paraphrase part of the text in your own words. So for instance, you might give a brief explanation of the meat hall in Beowulf, just using your own language, not quoting, but just kind of putting it in your own terms, before analyzing in detail how Grendel's incursion into the meat hall upsets the safety and community of that place. The second form of evidence you might bring in is descriptions of the literary features of the text. So this differs from references to the text because references to the text focuses on the content of what is being said, whereas the literary features focus more on how things are being said and the style in which it's written. So you might, for example, describe the use of alliteration in a line from Beowulf or define how the tone shifts throughout the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. And then the third way you might use text or evidence from the text is quotations from it. So quoting in a literary analysis is common as this forms the bedrock of your evidence, but you should still always have a good reason to quote. So the best times to quote are when a quote is especially relevant to a point you're making, or you're going to discuss in detail the use of word choice or syntax within the quote. So let's say you're analyzing a speech given by Desdemona in Othello that focuses on her loyalty to her husband. You should quote those places from the speech that best demonstrate what you're trying to show your readers about her loyalty. Quote wisely but sufficiently, and beware of overquoting. Your quotes should rarely be longer than a few lines at a time and should always follow MLA format. So speaking of MLA format, I have a few things to say about this. When you quote from anything written in poetic form, like Beowulf, the Canterbury Tales, and Othello, just as you do if you were quoting a work of prose, so like a novel, a short story, an essay, you want to make sure you get the quote exactly right. That is essential. So this also means adding in a forward slash, so it's that slash that's indicated right there, to represent any line breaks original to the text. So for example, now this example is from a 20th century poem, but if you were looking at a poem where the original lines looked like this: "At once a voice arose among the bleak twigs overhead, and a full-hearted evensong of joy illimited." So that's as it was written in the poem in the original. So if you're going to quote that, your quote would look like this. In Thomas Hardy's poem, The Darkling Thrush, and then you've got the quote, or then you've got my description of the speaker. This disheartened speaker suddenly hears the sound of the thrush. And then notice that within that quote, I put in those forward slashes to indicate where the line breaks were. So that's how you want to handle most of the time when you're quoting from a work of poetry or something that uses poetic form, as everything we've read so far does. You'll notice there too at the end that I include the line numbers. That's what that is right there. That's not page numbers. So for quoting from a poem, use the line numbers rather than the page numbers in parentheses. So as I just said, the 17 to the 20 in the above example refer to the line numbers being quoted. So that's the format you're going to use for Beowulf and the Canterbury Tales. But for quoting from a play, use the act, scene, and line numbers in parentheses. So if you're quoting from Othello, your quote would look like this. So Othello, in his rage at the possibility of Desdemona's infidelity, grabs Iago around his neck and yells at him, "Villain, be sure thou prove my love a whore." And you can see there that the 3.3 is because it's Act 3, Scene 3, and then lines 359 to 360. And I go on. If Iago can't provide definite proof, Othello continues, and I've got a second quote there: "Thou hadst been better have been born a dog than answer my waked wrath." And again, in parentheses, you'll see it's from the same act and scene and just a couple lines later. Notice that the quotation marks end before the parentheses. The periods go outside of the parentheses. There's lots of special rules about how to format this, and coming up I'll give you some links to some more information on that. So if you want additional help on citing properly, formatting titles, using parenthetical citation, those two links are especially useful. My assumption is that you all have some experience quoting and citing quotes. So if you need more help than what I've just provided you with, you should follow those links. Finally, or almost finally, I want to say a word just about incorporating quotes into your writing. The main thing that I want you to avoid is just saying something in your own words, making a point, whatever, and then putting a period, and then putting a quote without putting that quote into your own writing or using a signal phrase or anything, and then just going on with your point. You always want to integrate quotes into your writing, and all the examples I've just been giving you are examples of that. So you want to use signal phrases. Whenever you quote, you should always indicate that the quote is from another person than yourself. And here, those quotes are going to be from whichever author you're using, or the unknown author of Beowulf. You should almost never let a quote just stand by itself without incorporating it into one of your own sentences. You should always signal in some way that the quote is from somewhere else. One of the most common ways of doing this is through the use of a signal phrase. The following are some of the most commonly used such words. Those are just verbs that serve as signal phrases. You might write, Chaucer observes, Shakespeare contends, the author of Beowulf comments, describes, or whatever word you want to use. But you want to be constantly making it clear that the quotes you're using are from the text that you're looking at. and you want to integrate those quotes into your own writing, even if just simply from a phrase that says something like, Chaucer continues by saying that, quote. So here are some examples. These are just more, not from the literary text we're looking at, but just some other random examples. So Robin Hood believes firmly in this philosophy, we steal from the rich and we give to the poor. So again, that quote, we steal from the rich and give to the poor, is worked into my sentence that starts with that phrase, Robin Hood. The next one, I never understood why the governor always insisted that, quote, this state will never change its state bird, end quote, when the state bird has been extinct for over 100 years. So this is an example of working a quote into the middle of your sentence. You can also quote shorter quotes. You could have quote a word, a phrase. It doesn't have to be a whole sentence. Here it's a phrase. The next one starts with a quote. Courage is not courage when you have no choice, comma, end quote, claimed adventurer Chadwick Hennington after his safe return from his prolonged Arctic journey. So again, these are just examples. There's many ways to do this. The links that I provided you earlier in here give you lots more information on how to do this if you're not comfortable with it. It's also something that we could work on during live chat time. So no matter what, make sure you use a comma before the quote or a colon, or at the end of the quote to separate it from your signal phrase. End punctuation stays within quotation marks. And then you want to make sure that when you're doing this, that you alter your syntax for grammatical correctness. So whether you use a signal phrase or not, you should always make sure that your sentence with the quote in it is still grammatical. So normally the best way to do this is to make sure that the grammar of your sentence matches that of the quote. So now we're getting into sort of like, a little bit of like pulling out your hair kind of level of detail, like really like how important is this? This hopefully is not the kind of thing that you're going to be sweating over. It should at this stage hopefully come somewhat naturally. But if you know that it's something you struggle with, you might want to pay more attention to it. So I've got a few examples here. The first one, the Queen believes that England are a people of great resolve. You can hear already that it's grammatically incorrect. So you want to fix your writing so it matches the quote. The Queen believes that the English people are, quote, are a people of great resolve. The next one, it is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye, comma, the advice of the fox in Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince. So you can see that the doesn't even make sense, right? You kind of move from the quote into my writing in a way that just doesn't even work. So you want to fix the writing. What is essential is invisible to the eye, declares the fox. So now it's worked grammatically into my writing. And then the last example, the ratio of men to women at our university is appalling, comma, admonishing the president, right? So clearly, again, we don't have a subject-verb agreement here. So we want to fix it. The ratio of men to women at our university is appalling, comma, admonished the president of the school. So that's the kind of thing, this is especially something you want to do towards the end of the revision process. Before we talk about editing, so first, after you've written the draft itself, I recommend that you print up a double-spaced version of the paper and revise with a pen or pencil in hand on the printed version. Using this technique makes it much easier to truly re-see your work. I do this all the time. I find it much easier to revise my work when I have a printed version than when I'm working from my computer. If nothing else, it makes it feel a bit more rough to me, whereas something on the screen seems more finished and more polished. So another trick that can help you revision your work is to take a break between the writing of the rough draft and your revision. Sometimes it just takes some time to see your writing with fresh eyes. So this could be a matter of a few hours, a day, depending on how far in advance you're working, a couple of days. That'd be great. When you revise, you want to focus on the overall clarity of your analysis, your use of evidence from the text, how well you push your analysis beyond what is already obvious in the text, and the single main idea you see emerging from your analysis. So kind of big picture stuff is what you're looking for here. Do everything in your power to rely on your own insights and ideas about the passage you're analyzing and not what others have said about it. So if you've gone online, if you look at any resources online, you really want to be very careful with that because those can shape or overwhelm your analysis. The focus here really is your mind, you yourself grappling with that text. The entire purpose of this assignment is for you to honestly grapple with the details of a literary text and see what you can come up with. So just focus on doing your best work independent of going to any other source for help, beyond the ideas already raised by our class as part of our weekly discussions. So your ideas might be inspired by, and in fact, very, very often will be inspired by, emerge from our class discussion on discussion board. But that's where I would recommend trying to leave behind how you're influenced by others and then striking out on your own. And finally, the final edit. Before you submit the final draft, make sure you give the paper another review for basic editing issues like spelling, punctuation, and grammar, as well as making sure you're formatting your quotes correctly. Also, make sure you format your work according to the expectations of the course, so you can find those on the course syllabus on the homepage in terms of like the page layout and design and header information and all that. Make sure you give your work a title. Submit your final draft as a Word or PDF document. That's how I want that work submitted by the due date, and then just let it go. You did the best you could, so the next step is to give yourself a break before moving into the work for next week.